Okay, thanks everyone for coming to this ridiculously early session. This is, I believe, my 7th total Pub 4 in E2E. I'm really happy to be here, and just made grandfather, which is super cool. So Alex asked me to come talk to you guys today a little bit about desktop virtualization futures. And I think that maybe that's because I do a lot of desktop virtualization, so maybe he thought that'd be a good idea, but whatever. So let's get started. I want to spend a short amount of time just talking about kind of what I'm all about, like what I do for a living, so you guys kind of understand where I'm coming from. I'm not an analyst. I'm not like one of the people that just looks at products and comments on them, whatever. I spend probably 80% of my time consulting in the field. Most of my clients are Fortune 500 large companies. I don't do a lot of small, medium business.
How do you get your procrastinating time down to that?
Well,
really, mine will be a much bigger head.
This is sort of a sliding scale. So I like to believe it's this way. But yeah, so I do a lot of consulting. I do training on Zen and Zen Desktop actually with Benny over here. And I do speaking at events like Pub Forum and Synergy and VMworld and all that kind of stuff. And then I have horrible problems with procrastination and things that are shiny that get in the way. So Twitter, while you guys might think is brilliant, was really kind of wrecked me when it first came out, and I still have challenges with it because I have these problems where my attention span just gets lost and like something pops up on the screen and then an hour is gone of like reading tweets and doing stuff. And then, so I've actually made it a point now when I'm working for clients, I don't use Twitter at all the entire day because it just completely disrupts what I'm doing. So that's why you guys might find me like days of gap of like when I last tweeted because I'm in the middle of project work and I can't distract myself. So. Future of desktop virtualization, sort of, how do you look at what's going to be emerging, what's going to be coming in the next year? So you look into the crystal ball of desktop virt and say what's going to happen some number of years from now, like what's already happened up until now and what's going to happen later. And the general problem that I have with making predictions around desktop virtualization is I truly do believe that predictions are for suckers. So you guys probably know this French dude Nostradamus. He made all these cool predictions about what was going to happen in the future. The thing about Nostradamus that was cool is that he made these predictions a long, long time ago, and they were very general, right? So he made all these crazy terms that the flying iron bird was going to attack the blah, blah, blah. And then the cool part of what he said is that hundreds of years later, people were able to say, oh, he must have been talking about the 9/11 plane attacks. That's what that was, of course, the Iron Bird. So I think if you can make predictions that are completely abstract and let somebody interpret them how they want, that's the way you got to do it. But what you don't want to do is make predictions in the IT industry in the 2000 era. And the reason why is I don't care what anyone tells you. You cannot reliably predict 5 to 7 years in the future in IT. It's absolutely impossible. If you think that you could predict that amount of time in the past or in the future, then I probably should have bought a whole lot of Apple stock and Google stock because clearly I'm not rich, and I would have been if I predicted that they would have done as well as they had. So when we talk about desktop virtualization, I feel like the best predictions you can do is about 12 to 18 months out in the future. That's about it. Maybe 2 years if you're lucky, but you really can't predict anything past that. Why? Because I don't think anyone could have predicted the explosion of the smartphone and tablet market to the degree that it exploded in the last few years. And the next generation of that, which is coming in a very short order, I'd say the next 1 to 18 months, is wearable computing. So I'm not talking specifically about Google Glass, but the Internet of Things. I mean, in my house, I have a crap load of internet-connected devices, and that's only, and I wasn't joking when I said I almost have an entire Class C network in my house operating all the time between servers and workstations and various devices that have IP addresses. So, but this is going to get even further enhanced. I just bought a couple of months ago on Kickstarter. I'm a huge crowdfunding junkie, and I buy all these things on Kickstarter and Indiegogo, like new internet-connected devices. I bought an internet-connected water filter. What resonated for me was it actually tells you when to change the filter. I was like, brilliant, because I can't remember to change the freaking thing. So now my smartphone's going to go, doop, change the filter. Fine.
They have a little light that blinks when the filter needs.
You're not just going to go dismiss with that notification and then forget.
Most likely. I mean, notification overrun at some point. I'm going to need a notification system for the notification. So yeah, so it gets
and where would you fund that from? Just Kickstarter was that. So you need something to tell you all of the things that you already should be doing, and you'd fund it on Kickstarter.
Kickstarter or Indiegogo. So if you were to create a project that would help me manage my notifications, then perhaps I would back your project.
Excellent.
So,
2 minutes, yeah.
But the big problem with predictions, as I said, is that a majority of the time you make these predictions, you're wrong. And that's the unfortunate reality. And I give Brian Madden a lot of credit for sticking his neck out there and saying, making these blanket statements like, by 2013, 100% of desktops will be into VDI and these kind of things. But usually Brian's wrong. But that's okay. It's not wrong in my mind to make those predictions. It's just I don't want to be the guy making all these wrong predictions. So I tend to not predict that far in advance because I just think it's wrong. So, question is, how do we get where we are today with desktop virtualization? And I think a lot of how we got here was the fact that Gartner made this famous quote back in 2009. They said, hosted virtual desktop market will reach $65 billion by 2013. More than 40% of the worldwide PC market, professional PC market, will be virtualized in VDI, or that they call server-hosted virtual desktop. Now, of course, if you think about this from a factor crap perspective, this one definitely turned out to be crap in a big way. So the current market estimates on VDI is it's somewhere between about a $2 to $5 billion industry today. That's not to say that it's not growing, but it definitely has lagged behind the predictions of Gartner. And it's only currently about 2 to 4% of the worldwide PC market. Now, that being said, 80% of U.S. companies, and I don't know how this works in EMEA, but 80% of U.S. companies are either evaluating or in POC or in production deployments of VDI. So this number will increase. So from my perspective, it's not necessarily that Gartner was wrong. They were just potentially a little early on the prediction. I will tell you that from my consulting practice, every single project I'm working on in the U.S. is VDI related right now. Every single one of them. And projects I'm working on in EMEA as well. So I would say that this absolutely is a trend that's going to continue growing, and it will reach a point where it is about 60 to 80% of the worldwide PC market in the next probably, well, I'm not going to say how many years because I don't be one of those fools. But it's definitely happening. So I want to back up a little bit to talk about some things that I said about desktop virtualization in 2008 and kind of talk about how true this stuff was or how true it wasn't. So in 2008, Citrix had a Synergy event in Houston that I attended. They were launching the Zen Desktop product line. I presented one of the very first Geek Speak sessions at that Synergy, and my session was all about why you shouldn't use VDI. So I was very popular with all the Citrix execs. We had Mark Templeton and Wes Wasson and all these guys sitting in the back of the room like this during my session. And what I was told is that the Zen Desktop product management people were going to Nancy Kerrigan me in the expo hall. So I would have ended up, looking like this person afterwards. Do you guys know these people?
Yeah.
Okay. Didn't know if that was going to be a reason. I'd be like, what was that? Okay, so what did I say in 2011? I was at Pub Forum in Dublin, and I gave a similar presentation about the sort of emerging desktop virtualization trends, and what was the underlying theme that I saw with customers at that time, because I was working on desktop virt projects since 2008, 2009 timeframe. And what I found is that these sort of themes keep coming up with CTOs and CIOs at customers where they have some certain themes within the organization that are pushing them towards desktop virtualization. And I'm not going to go through all of these because I kind of went through all of them in 2011. I just wanted to bring this back up to say that these basic tenets of why people are doing desktop virtualization are still true today. So they're still having these exact same challenges. And let me be very clear in saying that some of the desktop virtualization products out there, much like I said in 2011, none of them solve all of these issues. What basically happens with desktop virtualization strategy is you have to go in and decide which of these things are most important to you. So pick your selection of goals. Once you define what things are most important to your organization, make your product or technical selection after you've decided which of these things are most important to you. Because none of the solutions, including VDI, or including Type 1, Type 2 hypervisor, or any of these kind of things, none of them solve every one of these issues. So make sure you pick which of these things are most important to you, and then do your design based upon that. So what am I saying in 2013? Now this is the part where everyone's going to get mad and say I'm crazy and I'm cracked and all that kind of stuff. But Gartner was absolutely right when they made their statement that the future is VDI for the Windows desktop. It absolutely is. They were just wrong on their timeline. They had said by 2013, yes.
Do you think they are wrong because they're just wrong, or is it just the economy that has gone even worse?
So you got to keep in mind that Gartner builds their opinions based upon customer feedback. So when Gartner was making these projections, it was because the companies they were consulting with that they were using to build their reference material were all saying, we're doing VDI, VDI is happening, whatever. And if you think about it, the vendors at the same time were, of course, pouring the Kool-Aid right down the throats of all the customers, telling them VDI, VDI, VDI. So I think where, Gartner made the prediction based upon the best actionable information they had. The problem was VDI, much like that Gartner hype cycle, was sort of that peak of inflated expectations. It was this is going to solve all of our problems, but nobody had gone through the fact checking of what were the gaps. So my session in 2008 about Zen Desktop and VDI in general was not that VDI was wrong, it's just that there were gaps. And as soon as those gaps are solved, then we can reevaluate this conversation about how applicable it is to every desktop. But in 2008, it was only applicable to a slim margin of desktops, and that's where Gartner made their calculations correctly. But if we fast forward to 2013, that's a completely different game. So that's the first thing I'm saying is that Gartner is absolutely right. They were just off by about 5 years.
So I think I know the answer to this, Sean. What did he say? Do you think that that's going to be stateless or persistent stuff?
I'll get to that in a minute.
Okay.
I'll get to that in just a minute. The second statement, which I'm sure will make a lot of people in this room uneasy and unhappy and twitchy, is that VDI will eat terminal servers lunch. Okay? And I'm not going to get into the religious debate about, terminal servers better or VDI is better and all this kind of stuff. And let me be very clear in saying that when I say VDI will eat terminal servers lunch, I don't mean that there will not be any terminal server in the future. I'm not saying that whatsoever. In fact, I've been one of the people that's been very pragmatic about saying there are reasons to use terminal server in combination with VDI, particularly for large enterprise organizations that have cross data center needs, because you're not going to serve a desktop in every single data center. You'll serve one primary desktop and you use terminal server to stitch in the apps from the other data centers. But I do believe, as a general rule, that as some of the barriers to VDI are solved, and many of them have already been solved, when a customer is focusing on do I do VDI or terminal server, VDI will be the de facto default for all those desktops in the near-term future. And I would say, this is even 2013, it's right now, that this is the default. And I know that I'm speaking to a room of people that VDI hasn't really caught on in Europe the same way that it's caught on in the US. But it absolutely will. So you guys might want to start building your VDI practice a lot more than you have, because this will be the default option in the future. So terminal server will start to wane, and this will start to take over in a big way.
I think that's true in terms of terminal services being more used than VDI. What I'm seeing is a lot more people starting off with VDI, and that's in EMEA, that's not US. Well, definitely the UK. We can't speak for the rest of Europe, although we try to. But a lot of customers are rocking up with, I want VDI please, and quite often VMware, just because they've got it for free.
Yeah. And I think the problem is customers oftentimes, they hear the buzzword VDI, they hear, they're reading Wired magazine or CIO magazine that you have to do VDI, and they don't really understand why they're doing it. So those are oftentimes going to be your failed projects because they're doing it for the wrong reasons. But
yeah, you haven't thought that VDI
right.
is a thing to have. It's
exactly.
Exactly. So if you haven't thought through why, and then if the fantastic project is, I need VDI, excellent, what are you going to use it for? I'm not sure. What could I use it for?
Yeah.
You've approached the problem wrong now.
Exactly.
We're really going to.
But for those people that have vetted the objectives of VDI and what it solves for them, I do truly believe that this will just skyrocket in the next several years. And as I said, every single project I'm working on right now in the States, and one project I'm working on in EMEA, they are all VDI related. So this is not going anywhere. It's going to be huge.
But that's also your skill set.
Yeah.
I mean, that makes why you are working on that project. I mean,
Of
if
course.
I would hire you...
Well, no, but let me clarify too. I'm also working on a large number of mobility projects as well. So it's not just because I've got a lot of VDI experience. I'm working on mobility projects as well. But when I look at the mobility projects versus VDI, I think about applicability to the large numbers of organizations. And today, mobility, which of course Citrix is reshaping their whole company to focus on mobility, this is still, in most companies I'm working with, about a 10 to 20% of the user footprint solution for mobility solutions, whereas VDI is reaching that 80-90% footprint. So that it's a different level of adoption. That's not to say mobility won't be at the 80-90% in 3 years, but today VDI is at that 90% mark for customers.
Yeah, but I think I can do 90% of what VDI does on the terminal server.
I disagree.
Yeah?
Yeah, I disagree. We can talk in deep detail about that over beers maybe later, but VDI will be a terminal server in the long term, and we'll talk about that over a beer later. So, my advice for 2013 and beyond, very simple, double down on VDI, and I'll explain the reasons why. Second one is do not be afraid of persistent VDI. And we'll talk about this in the context of why this is important, and it's not necessarily the right answer, Don't get me wrong, non-persistent pooled VDI is the better answer. It's just not the pragmatic answer, which is why I focus on persistent VDI. And I was one of these people back when I was doing these projects in early 2008, 2009 that was insisting on persistent VDI, and everyone told me I was out of my freaking mind. I'm crazy. And fast forward 5 years, and everyone's like, oh yeah, persistent VDI is the way to go. It's like, yeah, see, I told you.
You're talking to the wrong person because
Yeah.
I really couldn't disagree more. I mean, I hate persistent VDI. I mean, it's persistent VDI is made for bad managed companies. I mean,
And I disagree. Okay, this is more beer talk. More beer. Wonderful. I'm on slide 9, so we're going to be a lot of trouble if we don't progress forward. But over beer, we'll talk about this in much better detail. So, my opinion, do not be afraid of persistent VDI. Other stuff I wanted to talk about, but we won't get to, is drive mobility solutions in your organization. This is the whole EMM, MAM, MIM thing. We talk in great detail later over beers on why this is important. The industry is becoming mobile first, and I've got an entire massive slide deck where I talk specifically about this topic. But what's happening in the industry, and we don't often see this from a US or EMEA focal point because we have a rich history of deep level of computing, lots of expensive PCs that we bought and that kind of stuff. But if you focus on the emerging markets where there's populations that are massively higher than what our populations are, these countries are mobile first. Their data networks are now reaching a point where they're eclipsing the desktop footprint with mobile for internet browsing and transactions and e-commerce transactions, all that stuff. Mobile is absolutely happening in places like China, India, and Brazil at a far greater rate than it is on desktop compute. And longer term, the same thing will happen to us. It'll just take a little bit longer. But we'll get to that. The second thing is information security is really, really, really important. And the thing I always tell people is that don't act like it's someone else's problem. Information security impacts all of us. And the more times that you say, oh, there's a different group that does InfoSec, that's not my problem, you're sort of adding to the problem of the organization. Everyone has to be concerned about InfoSec. I have a much deeper presentation I do around information security and what you can do to improve your posture with regards to InfoSec. I don't have time to cover that all in here, but again, over beers later, we can certainly talk in deeper detail about what things you can do to make things better. The last one is configuration management, configuration logging systems. Automation and orchestration are very, very big topics right now. And of course, there's a cloud aspect of that, which some people get turned off by, so I'm not going to spend too much time preaching cloud. But what I will tell you is that the configuration management and orchestration piece is massively important to us in the future. And being traditional, stodgy, old IT guys that have been doing this for 10 or 15 years, you may not get the impact of this, but trust me, if you're not taking a cloud mindset in terms of automation provision of services, you're doing yourself a disservice. And there's a massive number of things that you could be doing to make things better in your organization. Now, unfortunately, this piece of the technology world is still at the very, very early stages. This is cloud and automation and orchestration for classic IT is sort of where VDI was in 2008. It's like everyone's talking about it, nobody's really doing it, but the minute that you get it and start doing it, it's going to ramp up like crazy. So I'd say now it's still early for these things. Make sure you start focusing on it. So let's go to the main topics I wanted to cover, and that's double down on VDI. So why do I say double down on VDI? If I go back and look at 2008 when this VDI market sort of began, one of the main problems that we had in 2008 was that the remoting protocols that existed back then, primarily HDX, PC over IP, RDP, that kind of stuff, they were not very advanced. And Benny and I have been doing our remoting protocol comparison stuff for some number of years now. And back in 2008, all of the protocols kind of sucked when it came to rich media. Even HDX wasn't that great. If you fast forward to 2013 and you look at the advancements, not only in HDX, obviously Citrix is always sort of on that leading edge, but even look at PC over IP. Did anyone pay attention to the differences in PC over IP from View 4.x to 5.x? It was a massive, massive performance difference and bandwidth differential. And Benny and I have data to back it up. And in many cases, PC over IP actually bests HDX from a bandwidth perspective and a user experience perspective. It's actually better. It's leaner on the wire, better user experience, higher fidelity. It beats HDX in a lot of cases. So VMware and Teradici have not been standing still. They've been advancing their stuff. Microsoft with RDP8. How many people are using RDP8 in the organization? Handfuls. Everyone should be. There's absolutely no reason to not use RDP8. It is phenomenal. At least a 10x improvement over RDP7 with most types of media and applications. So the multimedia codecs have gotten better and better, and there's even future things that are happening now. Everyone's moving to H.264 transcode. There's a lot of other things that will make it more ubiquitous across multiple client endpoint devices. And this is really what makes it super useful from my perspective. because having proprietary codecs doesn't help us in a device proliferation kind of situation. The second thing is think about what's happened with the internet. So if you look at the internet, this goes way back to 1990, beginning, very early stages of the internet. But if you look at what's happened even in 2010, the portion of total U.S.-centric view, but I'm sure EMEA is quite similar. We now have a situation where we've got this massive percentage of video traffic clogging the internet. So what we used to have before, where it was all kind of FTP and telnet and email and web and that kind of stuff, the web is declining, the peer-to-peer stuff is declining, and video and voice and kind of rich media things are taking over. So what does this mean from a virtual desktop perspective? If you don't have a remoting protocol that can do good video, you're not going to have a good solution. So it's very, very important that we focus on the emerging internet trends with respect to figuring out how to do virtual desktops. So the other thing is, in 2013, most of the modern database protocols have closed the gap. I don't care if you're focusing on HTTX, PC over IP, or remote FX, all remote FX, RDP8, depending on what you call it. All of these things have improved dramatically in the last 5 years, to the point where unless you're sort of a high-end graphical designer, it's almost usable over any type of network connection. So it reaches a point where, regardless of what kind of applications you're using, regardless of what type of user you are, you can support this over VDI or terminal server over almost any kind of network connection. And I say almost any kind because satellite still blows, and there's no good way to put it. So 3D graphics. That was supposed to be there. So 3D graphics. So there's two predominant, I actually copied a slide from another presentation, I forgot to delete that. So my bad. There's two predominant graphics manufacturers in the world, and I'm sure Intel would love to be in this space, but unfortunately they've been trying for years and have never quite made it. But we'll see if Haswell brings some of that. But if you look at NVIDIA and ATI, which is of course now owned by AMD, these are the two preliminary graphics powerhouses when it comes to computer graphics these days. For commodity purposes. And both of these guys are investing in ways to improve high-end 3D graphics in virtual desktop and terminal server environments. Now, one of these two is investing significantly more. Does anyone know which of the two is investing significantly more? If you attended Synergy this year, I'm sure it becomes painfully obvious to you. NVIDIA is pouring tons of money into virtual desktop high-end graphics. So specifically the NVIDIA Grid VGX platform. And there's actually two pieces of Grid that are important to know about, two pieces of VGX that are important to know about. The graphics card itself is not really anything that new. Inside here, it's just a series of Kepler GPUs. So if you have the existing Kepler K5000 card, P2000 card, whatever, it's the same GPU that's in those. It's just that they're putting multiple Keplers on the same card and more VRAM in most cases. But Grid is two things. It's the high-end Kepler GPUs and large amounts of DDR5 RAM, and it's also a virtualization platform. The VGX piece is enhancing the virtualization stack to support virtual GPU. And I'm not going to get into a whole lot of discussion about the different types of graphics support within the different stacks. Benny and I are doing a remote protocol session in like an hour or two. We'll talk about that. But NVIDIA is leading the charge on virtual GPU, and they're one of the only vendors actually doing this today. Ignore what Microsoft tells you about virtual GPU because they're doing API intercept. It's a completely different technology approach. These guys are actually doing true virtual GPU. So we'll talk about that more at 10 o'clock. Unified communications. So I made these graphics from some things, and I was very proud of them. It took me a long time. I'm not a graphics kind of guy. But if you look at unified communications, if we back up to 2008, a lot of people were talking about UC, and not a lot of people were actually doing it. Now in 2013, almost every one of my customers has some kind of a project kicked off, either around Link or Jabber or something like that. So they're needing to do something about voice video integrated communications with their virtual desktop. And a lot has happened in this space where third-party vendors have added a lot of support, as in Citrix and VMware have added support for taking the UDP traffic out of the display protocol as a hairpin and taking it outside as a direct UDP transport peer-to-peer. But on top of that, Microsoft actually has woken up and has done something about this as well. So Link 2013 now has native support for peer-to-peer outside of the hairpin mode. So UC is definitely driving a lot of these communications around doing VDI. And as I said, unified communications, 2008, not really practical to do in a virtual desktop. Today in 2013, whether it's Link 2010, Link 2013, Jabber, they're all functioning in virtual desktops. Now that's not to say that they're all going to work well on all types of client devices, but if you have a controlled set of client devices, you can make UC work in any of these VDI stacks without a problem. And whether you're using Cisco, Avaya, Microsoft Link, these guys all have solutions. Now, if you're using some other third-party, UC platform that's not one of these guys, you might not have the same luck getting it to work in a virtual desktop, but it always works hairpin if nothing else, which is honestly, from my experience, is not that bad. I've run UC stuff in hairpin mode many times, and as long as you've got acceptable bandwidth and good policy controls around it, it actually works quite well. The other thing is data connectivity. So if you look at data connectivity of what's changed over the few years, 2008, now this is going to be a U.S.-centric focus because I do these presentations in the U.S. If you look at the U.S. market, we've had 65% of U.S. households with computers had broadband internet access in 2008. And if you move forward, if you look at the mobile market, in 2008, U.S. consumers with 3G service was only 28% of us with mobile phones with 3G service. The question in the room, or are you just stretching? Stretching? Okay. Display remoting protocols in 2000 as well, as I said. Benny and I have done this now since 2009, where we've looked at the different display protocols. In 2008, these things didn't work very well, particularly on high latency networks or networks with a lot of jitter. So using a VDI or terminal server over a 3G modem was sort of not really sustainable. It was okay if you just had it in a pinch, had to get in and do something, but it's not a scenario you want to work with on a regular basis. However, 2013 and 2012, 90% of U.S. households with computers now have some form of broadband, whether it's cable, DSL, fiber, whatever. 90% of U.S. households have broadband. This is huge because now the whole work from home concept, anyone has access to the internet, they can work on a virtual desktop from anywhere in the U.S. In addition, in 2012, we had 139 million HSPA LTE 4G subscribers in the U.S. So it's roughly 44% of the population. Now, I realize, unfortunately for you guys, you don't have 4G yet in most places. But in the U.S., we're actually, for once, actually ahead in some ways in the data side, which makes me very happy. So you can go almost anywhere in the U.S. at any major metro city. Of course, not out in the suburbs and that kind of stuff in some of the farming regions. But in all the major cities, you can get 4G, LTE, or at least HSPA+, and have a very high-speed connection. 4G networks, obviously, several times faster than 3G. And of course, it's debatable exactly what what defines high speed. But most 3G networks top out somewhere in the 1 to 8 or 9 megabit range, whereas the 4G networks go up to about 20 megabit in a lot of cases, and can go much higher as the standards start supporting higher speeds. Most importantly, the latency on a 4G network is 1/10 to 1/2 what it is on 3G. So if you're on a 3G modem, you might have latencies in the 100 to 300 millisecond range. It's going to be highly variable. Under the 4G networks, I've seen latencies anywhere from 20 milliseconds to 80 milliseconds, and it's much more constant, which makes a virtual desktop perform very well over 4G networks. And the display remoting protocols, if we fast forward 5 years, have all reached a point where they work very well, even over 3G, but over 4G, it's a great experience, as long as you don't have high jitter and backup loss. So, this is the part where Jim Boyle wakes up. We're going to talk about storage space, IOPS, and latency. So a couple things. We all know virtual desktops take lots of IOPS. If you don't believe it, talk to Jim over a beer and he will drown you with stories about IOPS and latency and all sorts of throughput things that are fascinating to him, but most of us are like, blah, whatever. This is the one Jim will love. PI storage requirements for average IOPS is a recipe for failure. Every vendor, Citrix and VMware and Microsoft, all these guys included, say, 10 IOPS per virtual desktop is all you need, or 15 IOPS, whatever. And the argument I always tell people is, if that were true, and the regular IDE hard drive can serve me 80 IOPS on a SATA disk, then why are people buying SSDs for laptops? I mean, legitimate question. If 10 IOPS is all I need, then why doesn't a 5400 RPM SATA drive serve my needs for a laptop? And the reason why, much like Jim will probably applaud and slap me and give me a beer later, it's the peak IOPS that matter, right? And so when you run an application, you may easily consume 300 to 3,000 IOPS by booting Windows or by running those applications. So the reason why you have an SSD is to handle those peaks. You don't need, 5 or 10,000 IOPS throughout the entire life cycle of running Windows, but you do need it in that instant that you go to launch a program. And that's why SSDs are so important.
What about the argument that, I'm not saying I'm agreeing with that, but what about the argument that you have this much of IOPS and everybody is booting at slightly several sets? This is silly argument. So
you're talking about the staggering of I/O. The staggering of I/O is what you're referring to? because people work at different patterns. That's absolutely true until somebody in your organization sends out the corporate earnings video that everyone's tuned into at 10 o'clock, and all of a sudden your IOPS just hit the roof.
So that's not even true at all, and I've got lots of data to back that up, because the IO load just increases over the day till about 2 or 3 o'clock, and then it will decrease as people leave. So as more people have more applications open, and more tabs in their browsers and stuff like that, so your load will just increase. It isn't the case where you get that email, somebody needs 1,000 one time, and somebody else needs 1,000 the second after, and then it doesn't even out like the averages, you say. And I will go on about this too much, but I'll let Sean speak again.
Thank you. We don't want to get too started on IOPS. We'll figure it out here. So the calculations are bad. During boot, VDI of Windows desktop will be about 90% read, 10% write in general. And of course, this is benchmark your own copies of Windows and your own starting applications, because you may have different parameters. But generally speaking, 90-10 is about how it works from a boot perspective, maybe even 95-5. However, when you reach steady state, you're going to have about 10 to 20% read, depending on what you're doing, and you're going to have about 80 to 90% write. This is a general rule. This is not shit I'm making up. It's like this has been measured and proven many, many times. So this is another part. I think Jim's going to kiss me by the end of this thing. Read caching solutions like PBS can help boot storms, but they do not help write I/O at all. Now, I'll be careful when I say this, because there are scenarios in which PBS can make the write I/O seem less impactful. And the way that you do that is that with the write caching that PBS has, if you're smart about creating a tiered storage mechanism where the write caching is going to local storage, literally local on the blade, then yes, you've thereby distributed your write pattern where some of your persistent write I/O data is going to the SAN, and your discardable transient data is going to local disk that's going to refresh on boot. So if you design your PBS architecture like that, PBS can help or band-aid the write I/O, but they're not actually fixing the problem, they're just sort of spreading it out. And that being said, there are many, many people that design PBS where they do target device with a network-mounted disk that's right back on the SAN. Yeah. Now, if you choose to do that, you haven't done a damn thing for the writes, and you're all putting it back on the SAN. So that steady state where we said it's 89% write, that's all going back to your SAN. PBS did nothing to help make that any better. So if you want to make that better, you have to use an alternate solution that will actually offload the I/O from the SAN. So tiered storage on the SAN itself, flash caching on the SAN, Atlantis Ilios, it's Jim's in the front row, it's being so polite and smiling at me. Solutions like that would actually solve your problem. So, what else? Data access latency is ideally below 15 to 20 milliseconds. Now, I like it to be much lower than that. Preferably, from my perspective, it ought to be sub 10 or sub 5. But I've seen environments where it is 15 to 20. But if you're going beyond 20 milliseconds, you're really going to have a bad experience. And it's funny to me that so many people don't pay attention to data access or data store latency times, but this is what makes a virtual desktop suck or feel good. So, he's going to kiss me. I hope we don't get on camera. My wife will start touching me. So one way to resolve the IOPS and latency issues are through the use of SSDs. Now, it's not to say it's the only way to do it. There's many other software solutions like Atlantis and all these other guys that can solve the problem a different way. But SSDs can also solve this problem as long as you have SSDs that have intelligent tiering of data and you're not just trying to park the whole thing on SSD, because that can get incredibly expensive for obvious reasons. But if SSD goes the way of spinning disk and eventually it's 10 cents for a terabyte of SSD, then that's a completely different conversation that we'll have. So, 2013, VDI storage problems are within reach. So if you look at the cost of SSD in 2010, average commodity SSD, now granted, this is commodity SSD, not server SSD. We all know those are two very different things from a cost perspective. I'm just drawing a parallel on what happened on the consumer side, which will replicate itself on the server side eventually. So SSD price is $3 a gig, capacity for rarely above 128 gig. Fast forward to 2013, commodity SSD is 80 cents per gigabyte, with capacities around 26 and 512 being quite common. This trend will continue. We will have, terabyte SSDs that are super cheap if we look ahead 3 to 5 years. So I guess what I'm saying is this is coming.
Micron has it today, the L500 960 gig, and it is within that price range. It's available today. You can
what size?
2.5 inch drive.
Yeah. What capacity?
Its capacity is 960 gig.
960
the
gig.
M500 series.
So, it's getting there, obviously. And it's in this price range? It's in the 80 cents per gigabyte?
Yeah. It's cheaper, actually.
So, it's getting there. So, I say VDI storage problems are largely solved in 2013. That's not to say everyone's doing it the right way. I just mean the technologies are accessible to people that allow them to do this at scale with technologies you can buy off the shelf today. There are many players in the VDI storage space. I'm not going to tell you who to use, but obviously there's a lot of guys out there. Maybe you should buy people beers later, Jim. The last of the 5 topics I want to talk about is license complexity. So if you look at license complexity, in 2007-2008 we had VECD. And VECD was a bear because you couldn't run Windows on a data center virtual platform without buying VECD. And VECD was a license you had to buy on top of your SA license. So it was a couple of bucks per seat on top of that you had to buy on top of SA. So that was very, very expensive. In 2013, we have VDA and companion device license or companion subscription license, depending on what you want to call it today. So you have SA on top of full Windows PCs. They do have roaming user rights for remote users to use the desktop. Thin clients on SA covered assets, you have to buy VDA, which is of course $100 per device per year. People sort of miss out on that per device part. They sort of think like they can buy it for the machine and they're covered for wherever it gets used. No. You got to buy it for every single endpoint that is going to be connected to the system, and people kind of don't often realize that. Companion device license is going to be required for any employee-owned iPad, Android, tablet, those kind of things, because the VDA roaming use right will provide them access from a home PC, but it doesn't cover their additional peripheral access devices, so you need to buy additional licensing for that. If you have corporate iPads, you got to cover those under VDA. You're not going to get roaming rights for those, so it's a very expensive licensing thing. So I guess I should reiterate, 4 out of the 5 things I said have been resolved. Hopefully this one will be resolved in the next year or two, and Microsoft will wise up to the fact that they are killing the VDI market and killing the DAS market.
So, with the new possible DAS from Microsoft on Azure, they will have to change their ULA.
No, they won't, because the DAS that Microsoft's working on is terminal services based.
Really?
That's the standard. That's the standard at the moment. And that's why terminal services today is a better option for scale for virtualized desktops than VDI, because VDI licensing, desktop licensing, Windows OS desktop licensing.
It's ruining that market. It absolutely is.
It is hamstrung, shot to the knee fellas.
And even today, on the licensing that's available in Azure, you can't run RDS licensing in Azure today. So that's where the source of this issue really comes from Microsoft.
Yeah.
They don't offer RDS sales in Azure. So you can host on your own private IaaS infrastructure your RDS licensing, but you can't host it in Azure. So that's where this big issue comes with today. So that will be fixed as time goes on. So don't be afraid of persistent VDI. I call it the guy sitting in the beach with his feet up. Not persistent common image. So I think of it like this. All the vendors have this, car salesman that's like, just imagine one VDI image for all of your users, and you'll be a happy IT administrator when you can update one image and blast it across 10,000 users. The problem with this is, and let me be very clear that I'm not talking about building machines off one common image. Like everyone's had that for years. That's nothing new. I'm talking about a non-persistent pooled common image that's used across 10,000 machines, each with their own unique personality and their own unique applications. That is simply not practical. I don't care what any vendor tells you, this shit just doesn't work. So, and people that say that I'm crazy, that what you could do is you could just take a computer, you could put an operating system on it, you could add some machine-specific software distributions, you could use a personalization layer like user state virtualization, add some layered departmental applications, add some efficiently streamed virtualized applications, add some XenApp delivered applications where needed, and have a best-in-class, efficient, agile, state-of-the-art technology. And that may be is every time I go into a customer and say, we're going to put all this shit together and deliver your desktops, they go, well, what happens when it doesn't work? And I'm like, it'll work. It'll work. I get myself like, what if it doesn't work? So make it simpler. The other thing I tell people too is that your desktop image choice affects your rollout schedule. Am I out of time?
Yeah.
Oops. Okay. So the key thing is, if you do persistent VDI, you can be deploying in 1 to 3 months. If you do that layered technology approach, it may take you 6 to 9 months to assess the desktop environment and roll everything out. So with that, thank you very much.